My name is Anthony Uhlmann, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to this conference. And I'd very much like to thank the conference organisers. So the title of my paper is Virginia Woolf's The Waves, Desire and Ethology. I'm reading this to you from the outskirts of Sydney, and it's traditional in Australia now to offer an acknowledgement of country, recognising the traditional owners of the land on which an event takes place. So I'm very pleased to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Darug people, and to indicate and underline that Aboriginal people's thought is often deeply ethological, as is their concept of country. My previous work, most recently linking J.M. Coetzee's writing process and practice with ethology, the socio-political environments with which he engages. I'm a writer of fiction, but mostly I'm a literary critic that engages with philosophy, and I'm currently working with a philosopher from Sydney University, Moira Gatens, on a project relating Spinoza to literature, and this paper draws heavily on that work. So this paper will juxtapose and relate systems of thought which are at times distinct. Literary fiction is not philosophy or biology. Philosophy is not biology or literary fiction. Virginia Woolf's thought, Deleuze and Guattari's thought, Spinoza's thought, Gilbert Simondon's thought, Jakob von Uexküll's thought, by no means line up exactly, since they each emphasize different kinds of relations. Yet all are in sympathy, since they involve the foundational idea that life and meaning are composed of relations, and things come into being and out of being through processes of becoming, rather than being fixed entities. Deleuze and Guattari draw all the others mentioned here into relation with their own system of thought. In the other cases, clearly, they're not directly engaged with the work of the others. I'll begin with a postulate that the foundational affinities, relationality, becoming, are enough to justify the resonances that can be found among these works. Such affinities can be explained through the concept of analogy developed by Gilbert Simondon, which is indeed echoed by one of the founders of ethology, Konrad Lorenz. While there can be imprecise analogies, precise analogies are not accidental. To cite Muriel Kuhn's on Simondon, the founding act of this method, the analogical act, is defined as a putting into relation of two operations. In the Sophist, Plato describes the analogical act as an act of thought that consists in transporting an operation of thought that has been learned and tested with a particular known structure, for instance, the one that serves to define the fisherman in the Sophist, with another particular structure that is unknown and the object of inquiry, the structure of the Sophist in the Sophist. Plato's discussion already makes clear that the transfer of operations is not grounded in an ontological terrain common to the two domains, in a relation of identity between the Sophist and the fisherman, but rather establishes an identity of operative relations. Whatever the difference between the terms, on one side the Sophist, on the other the fisherman, the operations of production, seduction, capture are the same. For his part, Konrad Lorenz explains the analogical act as follows. One of the most customary and hackneyed objections to which ethologists have to listen is that humans are unique and that every attempt to understand human nature by the approaches of ethology is not only doomed to failure, but shows a contemptible blindness for the august nature of humanity. In particular, we are wont to hear that we are drawing false analogies and that we are hugely underestimating the essential differences separating humans from the rest of organic creation. The answer is that we are not and we do not. In fact, there is no such thing as a false analogy. Analogy can concern only a greater or a smaller number of characteristics and thereby endow the deduction of a common function with a greater or smaller probability. With this said, it's still worth making some points with regard to differences between the systems at the outset. Deleuze and Guattari's definition of ethology involves a drawing into relation of key examples and ideas from the work of Jakob von Uexküll with Spinoza. In the same way that we avoided defining a body by its organs and functions, we will avoid defining it by species or genus characteristics. Instead, we will seek to count its affects. This kind of study is called ethology, and this is the sense in which Spinoza wrote a true ethics. A racehorse is more different from a workhorse than a workhorse is from an ox. Von Uxküll, in defining animal worlds, looks for the active and passive effects of which the animal is capable in the individuated assemblage of which it is a part. They then go on to cite the famous example from von Uxküll of how the tick can be defined by three affects of which it's capable. I'll return to this point, as affect and perception via the disposition or ingenium of an individual is essential to Spinoza's concept of one's capacity to understand and increasing one's power to act. And these ideas too can be analogically related to von Uxküll's concept of the Umwelt. Writing about the Umwelt in relation to Virginia Woolf and the complex affects human beings experience, Patricia Ward draws it into relation with contemporary theories of cognition. Neural activity is embedded in a dynamic system that informs an ongoing bodily schema, silently and implicitly orienting a core sense of self through feeling, sensation, perception in relations of nearness, distance, depth, surface, here and now, here and there. This provides our most fundamental sense of being in the world, a world of constantly changing and shifting relations, where responses to environmental change alter the rhythms of the organism that in turn reshapes the environment as an ecological niche. This idea was first adumbrated by Jakob von Uxküll in 1909 as a theory of the Umwelt. It is how Woolf experienced the modern world as an age clearly when we are not fast anchored where we are. Things are moving around us. We are moving ourselves. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari only directly mention the Umwelt once, when they distinguish the Welt of the scientist from the Umwelt of the animal. Yet they avoid using this concept directly. Instead, they use von Uxküll's idea of transcoding, where, for example, the spider's web finds its counterpoint in the fly, emphasizing von Uxküll's insistence on the musical form of nature being a precise analogy of interactions between species, to explore their own terminology. For Deleuze and Guattari, rhythms and milieus emerge from the chaos and were drawn together through transcoding. Yet this is not the end of the process as they see it, as a territory has to be made through forms of expression, a territory in which one might live and into which one might invite and draw others. There is a territory precisely when a milieu components cease to be directional, becoming dimensional instead, when they cease to be functional to become expressive. There is a territory when the rhythm has expressiveness. What defines the territory is the emergence of matters of expression, qualities. Take the example of colour in birds or fish. Colour is a membrane state associated with interior hormonal states, but it remains functional and transitory as long as it is tied to a type of action, sexuality, aggressiveness, flight. It becomes expressive, on the other hand, when it acquires a temporal constancy and a spatial range that make it a territorial, or rather territorializing mark, a signature. Rather than going on to analyze the concept of territory in Deleuze and Guattari, however, using their work as a center of reflection on the nature of ethology, I want to turn to a reading of the work of Virginia Woolf in relation to Spinoza and von Uxküll. This then involves accepting Deleuze and Guattari's definition of ethology, cited above, which links von Uxküll's emphasis on defining an individual in relation to the effects of which it's capable, to Spinoza's similar understanding that the power of any individual body is determined by the affects of which it is capable, and our power increases insofar as we are capable of being affected by and affecting more things, and decreases insofar as we become less capable of being affected or by or affecting other things. Christina Alt has written of Virginia Woolf in relation to ethology, arguing that Woolf indicated her familiarity with the work of several of the pioneers of ethology, among them Jean-Henri Fabre, W.H. Hudson, and Julian Huxley. This study goes into great detail about Woolf's own interest in natural history and her readings of these authors and how they influenced her works. The examples Alt uses are determined by tracing works Woolf read, and here, of course, the scientists she read are properly precursors to ethology, rather than the founders of the discipline. She is also more concerned with tracing lines of influence than exploring theoretical aspects of the relation of Woolf's work to the theoretical frames of ethology. This paper will accept a definition of ethology that strongly associates ethology to the existence of animals within their environment, one which asserts that this relation between a being and its environment is essential to understanding the capacities of any being and its powers of existence. This concurs with Deleuze and Guattari's reading of Spinoza, which insists on bringing to light the relations that determine what a body can do. It also draws upon readings of Spinoza, recently developed by Moira Gatens and I, that highlight the importance of desire understood as a dynamic relation between dispositions and modifications of dispositions and capacity. It further concurs with Gilbert Simondon's insistence that individuated beings always emerge from and carry with them pre-individual potential. The individuated crystal, for Simondon, can only emerge from the pre-individual potential of, say, a supersaturated fluid, and it is the specific nature of this pre-individual environment that allows particular individuals to emerge. So in Spinoza, desire is forcefully linked with the essence of being to conatus and virtue. When this striving is related only to mind, this is quoting Spinoza, when this striving is related only to mind, it is called will. But when it is related to the mind and body together, it is called appetite. This appetite, therefore, is nothing but the very essence of man, from whose nature then necessarily follow those things that promote his preservation. Desire can be defined as appetite together with consciousness of appetite. It's further linked to disposition and is capable, desire that is linked to disposition and is capable of undergoing modification. Moira Gatens and I have recently published a paper on the importance of disposition to Spinoza. In the first definition of the definition of the affects in Book 3 of the Ethics, Spinoza affirms that desire is man's very essence, insofar as it is conceived to be determined from any given affection of it to do something. This definition of desire links to the discussion of disposition or ingenium, which Moira and I have developed in our article, which has just been published by the Journal of Intellectual History. Ingenium can be translated as innate quality, temperament, or natural disposition or capacity, character and talent, and concerns the particularity of any given individual. Spinoza also uses the verb dispone, to manage, order, arrange, and the noun dispositio, disposition, arrangement, when discussing the way in which bodies are ordered or disposed. And here we take these terms to be closely connected insofar as they refer to how the capacities of bodies are aligned with the manner in which their affects are arranged or ordered. We also argue that ingenium, dispono, and dispositio can also be related to composite bodies or groups. Groups within societies are disposed in certain ways, and their capacities to understand are determined by the disposition or arrangement of their typical affective characteristics. As Spinoza observed in theological political treatise, customs and laws form individuals in ways that can, quoting, lead a nation to have its particular mentality, its particular character, and its particular prejudices. In other words, complex bodies, like bodies politic, take on a character or form according to the ways in which the affective lives of the individuals who compose it have been arranged. If we're not able to live strictly according to reason, what other method might we use to counter these external forces and open our capacity to understand? Spinoza shows how a different kind of relation to our disposition can offer a way out of this impasse. Surprisingly, perhaps, Spinoza demonstrates how we can move towards greater understanding through the affects. In the Ethics, Part 4, Proposition 38, he states, whatever so disposes the human body that it can be affected in a great many ways, or renders it capable of affecting external bodies in a great many ways, is useful to man. The more it renders the body capable of being affected in a great many ways, or of affecting other bodies, the more useful it is. On the other hand, what renders the body less capable of these things is harmful. In our paper on disposition, Moira and I argue that even if we can never achieve the degree of adequate knowledge that would allow us to live in perfect accordance with reason, we can still develop a plan for living where we strive to arrange our affects such that they are affected more by joyful affects than sad affects. If, as Deleuze and Guattari emphasize in linking von Uxküll with Spinoza, we're defined by the affects of which we're capable, this correspondence of desire and disposition is essential to our understanding of our capacities as human beings. From the very beginning of The Waves, Virginia Woolf emphasizes the different dispositions and different capacities of 6 protagonists: Bernard, Susan, Lewis, Rhoda, Neville, and Ginny. Even when exposed to the same external stimuli as young children, the dawn chorus as the sun rises over their new day, they see and feel different things. "I see a ring," said Bernard, "hanging above me. It quivers and hangs in a loop of light." "I see a slab of pale yellow," said Susan, "spreading away until it meets a purple stripe." "I hear a sound," said Rhoda, cheep, chirp, going up and down." "I see a globe," said Neville, "hanging down in a drop against the enormous flanks of some hill." "I see a crimson tassel," said Ginny, "twisted with golden threads." "I hear something stamping," said Lewis. "A great beast's foot is chained. It stamps and stamps and stamps." This in turn is connected to ideas of desire and dispositions. The novel follows the protagonists as their lives play out in accordance with dispositions which announce themselves at the beginning, but are nevertheless modified as the book follows them through the long day of their lives. Bernard offers a summary in the final section of the novel. "But we are all different. The wax, the virginal wax that coats the spine, melted in different patches for each of us. The growl of the boot boy making love to the tweenie among the gooseberry bushes. The clothes blown out hard on the line. The dead man in the gutter. The apple tree stark in the moonlight. The rat swarming with maggots. The lustre dripping blue. Our white wax was streaked and stained by each of these differently. Lewis was disgusted by the nature of human flesh. Rhoda by our cruelty. Susan could not share. Neville wanted order. Ginny love, and so on. We suffered terribly as we became separate bodies." Yet Woolf complicates the idea of disposition further, since each of the protagonists is not merely one person. Rather, they carry contradictory selves within them, selves determined by competing desires. This is particularly true of Bernard, the protagonist, who speaks most and is allowed to finish the novel with the long final monologue. Bernard reflects on this, underlining this problem of competing desires, which for him is connected to emulation, as he tries to imitate various heroes or exemplars, such as Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, or a character in Dostoevsky, as the reason the others fail to understand him. But it's equally true of all the others. He states, "They do not understand that I have to effect different transitions, have to cover the entrances and exits of several different men who alternately act their parts as Bernard." As we'll see, desire is further complicated as it involves both longing for what seems essential to each self and emulation, as one desires to be loved and accepted by others, and so to want what they want, do what they do. That'll be established in relation to reading of Spinoza. The working title for The Waves was The Moths, as the original idea for the novel occurred to Woolf after her sister Vanessa Bell shared a story in a letter written from Cassis in the south of France, where she was on holidays, about moths. "I sit with moths flying madly in circles round me, and a lamp. You cannot imagine what it's like. One night some creature tapped so loudly on the pane that Duncan said, 'Who was that?' 'Only a bat,' said Roger, 'or a bird.' But it wasn't man or bird, but a huge moth. Half a foot, literally, across." The moth, led by the desires determined by the affects of which it is capable, is drawn to light, to the point of beating its body against sources of light, emblematic and the the image of the moth becomes emblematic of desires. In his essay, The New Concept of Umwelt, a link between science and the humanities, von Uxküll, after repeating his famous example of the tick and how the affects of which it is capable define its Umwelt, moves to an example based on moths. Though it's unlikely Virginia Woolf knew this example, and though von Uxküll refers to the senses of smell and sound, her reading and his resonate. The odour from a female moth, Saturnia piri, attracts the male moths over distances of several miles. The numerous odours that fill the air are non-existent to the males. In a completely odourless space, where the smell of the female is the only one perceived, its attraction becomes overwhelming. This effect also applies to sounds. There are moths that can hear only 2 tones. These tones correspond to the sound of the squeak of the bat that is the main enemy of these moths. In the complete silence of the Umwelt of the deaf, the appearance of the only perceivable tone must have the overwhelming effect as the only smell in an odourless space. In this case, it does not attract, but as it is emanating from an enemy, it triggers rapid flight away from the danger. The effects von Uxküll describes, of course, are also desires or dispositions that determine what the moth can do, fleeing a foe and seeking a mate. In both cases, these are examples of the moth's conatus, using Spinoza's terms, striving to continue to exist, which Spinoza tells us involves the identification of desire, essence, and power. So too, Woolf's moths are emblems or symbols of desire itself, and the motif recurs numerous times in the novel. The Waves examines the nature of desire and clearly relates this to individuated beings and their need to continue their conatus and their need to express. Neville states, "The desire which is loaded behind my lips, cold as lead, fell as a bullet. The thing I aim at shopgirls, women, the pretense, the vulgarity of life, because I love it, shoots at you as I throw. Catch it. My poem." Expression itself, the need to communicate desires and convey them to others, is a desire shared by all the protagonists in The Waves, who all might be read in some sense as versions of a creative self. If the moths described by Vanessa Bell was one of the key images that goaded Virginia Woolf towards her novel, another which came before it was that of a fin glimpsed far out at sea. The Waves first comes into view when Woolf writes in her diary of September 30, 1926, "One sees a fin passing far out. What image can I reach to convey what I mean?" The fin becomes a symbol for meaning itself, for truth itself, that needs to be grasped, expressed, conveyed to others as a rhythm, a feeling, through poetry, for example, or stories. Their experience involves the complex Umwelt of these desires. On the one hand, the desires or affects that form one's disposition and that drive the self, just as the moth is drawn to those things that affect it, that comprise the Umwelt. Yet on the other hand, they also desire to communicate, to express the very Umwelt that limits and surrounds them, to convey or fail to convey the sense of meaning or truth one has felt, one has glimpsed, like a fin rising out of the waters far out at sea. Deleuze and Guattari see art as being defined by affects, the desires that determine what a body can do, and percepts, the desire to perceive and to generate perceptions in others. I've written elsewhere on Woolf's interest in Paul Cézanne and his logic of sensations, which is in turn taken up by Deleuze. Cézanne emphasizes how the sensation that comes from nature, which itself expresses sensation, is felt within as sensation or affect, and expressed on the canvas as the touches or sensations of the brush, conveying percepts, conveying sensations to the viewer in turn. But in order for this circuit to be closed, the hand of the reader must catch the ball thrown by the poem. If von Uxküll sees the contrapuntal sympathy of the spider and the fly Just as Henri Bergson sees the sympathy of the wasp and the larvae in creative evolution as a precise analogue of musical form, Deleuze and Guattari extend this in A Thousand Plateaus, so that the child that sings to calm her nerves and make a world where she can live in, the bowbird that decorates and performs to charm his mate, desires to extend beyond the bubble of the self in order to create a territory that others can share. This, for Deleuze and Guattari, is essentially the desire that is expressed through art. The Waves itself is an example of this desire to form a territory and to feel one's way towards a method of achieving it. Virginia Woolf approaches this through questions of form. Her early idea for The Waves was to write a new kind of play, away from facts, free yet concentrated, prose yet poetry, a novel and a play. This new form would involve an emphasis on rhythm, the poetic, rather than the plot or narrative, although the idea of the story remains a crucial element in the novel, particularly through the protagonist Bernard, who writes stories. So too, the motif of the waves and the rhythms of poetic language tie together the six protagonists who are divided by their particular desires, but connected by these rhythms. That is in sympathy with the insights of Van Uxküll, Bergson, and Deleuze, who all insist on the image of music as an analogue for sympathy that goes beyond an individual being. Woolf attempts to build a territory that can accommodate every individual desire, or only six as an example of a still greater whole. This complex idea might be imagined as a larger human Umwelt, shimmering with the myriad affects of which we, as many, many different human individuals, are capable, and the contradictory desires that drive us. Again, Bernard attempts a summary, sketching how individuated Umwelts melt into larger ones. The crystal, the globe of life as one calls it, far from being hard and cold to the touch, has walls of thinnest air. If I press them all will burst. Whatever sentence I extract whole and entire from this cauldron is only a string of 6 little fish that let themselves be caught, while a million others leap and sizzle, making the cauldron bubble like boiling silver and slip through my fingers. Faces recur, faces and faces. They press their beauty to the walls of my bubble. Neville, Susan, Lewis, Ginny, Rhoda, and 1,000 others. How impossible to order them rightly, to detach one separately, or to give the effect of the whole. Again, like music. In the Ethics, Spinoza offers a definition of the affects. This is in part 3 of the Ethics. These are tied to the 3 primary affects, love, hate, and desire. An individual's disposition can be complex and even contradictory. Early in the definition of the affects, Spinoza defines desire. By the word desire, I understand any of a man's strivings, impulses, appetites, and volitions, which vary as the man's constitution varies, and which are not infrequently so opposed to one another that the man is pulled in different directions and knows not where to turn. Affects, then, are unavoidable. They necessarily involve our very essence, since we all feel desire, since we all are comprised of conatus, which is identified with our desire and essence. Yet it's not necessary that these affects or dispositions be absolutely fixed. After defining desire, Spinoza turns to joy and sadness. Here he states that joy involves a man's passage from a lesser to greater perfection, and sadness, man's passage from a greater to lesser perfection. He emphasizes the idea of passage. These affects are not fixed states. Sadness is not the lesser perfection itself, since man cannot be saddened insofar as he participates in some perfection. He continues, nor can we say that sadness consists in the privation of a greater perfection, for a privation is nothing, whereas the affect of sadness is an act by which man's power of acting is diminished or constrained. The affects involve process then, acts that involve change, and can never be resolved into fixed states. The movement of affects, the act of change of affects, is normally ongoing, as one affect is overtaken and replaced by a stronger affect, though it is possible to be fixed in place. And I'll touch on this below. The next section is on concepts of the affects in Spinoza called longing and emulation. The definition of the affects are broken into a number of parts. Definitions 1 to 5, he actually uses Roman numerals, but I've just simplified this with the normal ones. So definitions 1 to 5 consider the 3 primitive affects: desire, joy, and sadness, and 2 non-affects, wonder and disdain. 6 to 17 then consider how joy and sadness are related to or associated with external causes. For example, love is a joy associated with the idea of an exterior cause. Hate is a sadness associated with the idea of an exterior cause. 18 to 24 concern how joy and sadness are associated through empathy or antipathy with our feelings towards others. For example, pity is sadness associated with the idea of an evil that has befallen someone we imagine to be like us. Favor is love towards someone who has benefited another, and indignation, hate towards someone who has done evil to another. 25 to 31 concern feelings we have towards our own self. For example, self-esteem is a joy associated with the contemplation of our own power, and humility, a sadness associated with the contemplation of our weakness. Definitions 32 to 48, however, move away from a consideration of those things that we associate with joy and sadness to a consideration of desire. As such, these affects might be understood not only to be acts of or passages from greater to lesser power or lesser to greater power, but also, and perhaps more tellingly, to potentially involve our very essence or disposition. While the former might quickly pass as a different affect overcomes the former and replaces it, the latter might persist and might even characterize individuals, either for a period of time that might involve moments, days, or years, or for a lifetime, becoming ruling passions that determine how we respond to the world more generally. Longing, emulation, thankfulness, this is the list of the examples of emotions of desire that Spinoza gives in the definition of the affect. Longing, emulation, thankfulness, benevolence, anger, vengeance, cruelty, timidity, daring, cowardice, consternation, human kindness, ambition, gluttony, drunkenness, greed, and lust are not only affects but dispositions that might either vary if we're able to reorder them and shift from one state to another state, whether it be good for us or bad for us, or might become fixed as we fixate upon these affects. In part 5, proposition 9 of the Ethics, Spinoza states that an affect is evil or harmful an affect is only evil or harmful insofar as it prevents the mind from being able to think. With this said, not all dispositions are equal. We should endeavor to align our disposition with affects that are joyful rather than those that are aligned with sadness. This indeed is where Spinoza underlines the power of the mind to order the affects. In discussing the last 5 of these affects of desire, ambition, gluttony, and drunkenness, which are paired with regard to food and drink respectively, and greed and lust, Spinoza underlines that they have no opposites because moderation, sobriety, and chastity indicate the power of the mind and not a passion. As Spinoza shows elsewhere, and as Moira and I discuss in our paper on disposition, Spinoza recommends a plan for living that involves our engaging with a variety of experiences and feelings and stimulating the imagination through art, love of nature, and other such pursuits. These affects of desire, however, can be further divided, apart from the final 5 which have just been discussed. The first 2, I would argue, are essential to an understanding of the capacities of literature. Longing is a desire or appetite to possess something which is encouraged by the memory of that thing, and at the same time restrained by the memory of other things which exclude the existence of the thing wanted. This aligns with nostalgia, the elegiac, as well as to fantasies of maintaining or attaining what we know cannot be any longer, or cannot be at all, or cannot be for much longer. So much literature is infused with longing, regret for what is past or might never come, nostalgia or utopia or dystopia. It might be argued that literature has a capacity not only to convey affects that might pertain to characters and the societies from which they emerge, anger, vengeance, cruelty, timidity, cowardice, and consternation, or might momentarily affect those characters and situations, envy, hope, fear, confidence, despair, gladness, remorse, and so on, but to offer underlying affects of desire, such as longing and emulation, which situate the works and even direct the development of generic conventions within art. Morrigatens has written at length and profoundly on the importance of the exemplar to certain modes of literary production. And I would argue that it's worth considering how this process might be tied to the affect of emulation, both for good and for bad. Spinoza states, emulation is a desire for a thing which is generated in us because we imagine that others have the same desire. The power of imitation in literature has been highlighted since Aristotle. This affect involves at its core the imitation of the affects of others. As such, it is involved with affects understood as signs. It can be good if we seek to emulate behavior or aspire to norms that will increase our power. On the contrary, it can be bad if we emulate norms that are contrary to our power. This, of course, is not all that is involved with the concept of the exemplar and exemplarity that Spinoza develops, but it's useful to consider how it might engage with it and how it, too, is made use of by artists to allow us to understand or reflect. Spinoza ends the section definitions of the affects by saying that he will pass over other affects, like jealousy, which arise from a composition or relation of affects he's already defined, and because most of these other emotions do not have names. He states, it is clear that they all arise from desire, joy, or sadness, or rather that they are nothing but these three, each one generally being called by a different name on account of its varying relations and extrinsic denominations. Emulation and the exemplar are related, but there is complexity to these terms, which don't simply mean that it is always a good thing to imitate behavior. In The Waves, as I've mentioned, Bernard wants to be Byron, Shelley, a character from Dostoevsky. And there are so many examples of how literary works enter into our worlds and form us. And right at the beginning of the form of the novel, the problem of emulation was a key theme for Cervantes in Don Quixote, which Woolf seemingly alludes to at the very end of The Waves. While emulation is by no means accounts for everything in art, it weaves its way in and out of it as positive and negative exemplars of beings that might be like or unlike ourselves, fire our imaginations and provoke us to think. What of longing? Certain artistic forms, such as the requiem in music, the elegy in poetry, might be related to the kind of nostalgia for things lost Spinoza ties to longing. But longing is also a desire for things that have not yet come into being, and so it can be found in lyrical forms linked to desire and sensual being, or longing can take on a spiritual dimension, or one of material attainment, physical prowess, quests for spiritual or logical enlightenment, endeavor, adventure, expertise, accomplishment. All of these involve longing, sometimes mixed with emulation, as one seeks to imitate what seem to be the desirable affects and percepts of others. So the next section is on longing and how it structures the waves. The waves moves from longings to be attained as the children seek to enter into life and become who they desire to be, but then it hardens as the possibilities of what might be attained narrows. The narrowing relates to habit, to obligations that stand in the way of pursuing what is longed for, but such habits have two sides. They not only reduce and narrow the protagonist, but equally serve to hold them together, containing them in their characters, their Umwelts. Listen, there is a sound like the knocking of railway trucks in a siding. That is the happy concatenation of one event following another in our lives. Knock, knock, knock. Must, must, must. Must go, must sleep, must wake, must get up. Sober, merciful words which we pretend to revile, which we press tight to our hearts, without which we should be undone. how we worship that sound like the knocking together of trucks in a siding. Insofar as this leads to disappointment, as who one wanted to be does not square with who one is, longing doesn't diminish. Rather, it takes on a different face, no longer looking forward in expectation, but back, whether in satisfaction or disappointment. At the close of the day, it might be overcome, but only insofar as one no longer desires or has expectations to reflect on the meaning or meaningfulness of what is and has been. This is seen in the waves with the character of Bernard, who began with nothing but faith in stories and in his ability to tell them. As things progress, however, he comes to doubt, wondering which is the true story. Finally, an old man whose youthful desires have largely run their course, he completely loses faith in the story that is neatly tied up and full of meaning, the story based on the idea of plot, of purpose. He states, of a story of a design, I do not see a trace. And later, Bernard takes up the imagery of wasteland that is usually associated with Lewis in the novel, and critics have suggested that he's modelled on T.S. Eliot. The self that encompasses him seems to no longer work, no longer feel, no longer express. So this is Bernard. This self now, as I leant over the gate, looking down over fields, rolling in waves of colour beneath me, made no answer. He threw up no opposition. He attempted no phrase. His fist did not form. I waited. I listened. Nothing came. Nothing. I cried then with a sudden conviction of complete desertion. Now there is nothing. No fin breaks the waste of this immeasurable sea. Life has destroyed me. No echo comes when I speak. No varied words. This is more truly death than the death of friends, than the death of youth. But this is not where things end. If death represents meaninglessness, senselessness, a failure of affect and percept, Bernard ends his monologue by returning to emulation and longing, however childish, however human, echoing Don Quixote's tilting at windmills. Death is the enemy. It is a death against whom I ride with my spear couched and my hair flying back like a young man's. I strike spurs into my horse. Against you I will fling myself unvanquished and unyielding, O death. I'll end with what has been for me a problem, something that I haven't understood. Perhaps versions of this misunderstanding have repeated in my approach to what are similar problems. I see this misunderstanding as also being echoed in the waves, in the passage I've just referred to. By misunderstanding, I don't mean simple mistake, but some kind of limit point, some kind of limit to my capacity to understand. That is, do things mean at all? Or is meaning something we construct as a means of organization? I wanted to return to von Uexküll's Umwelt. Is the Umwelt particular to each individual, each moth, each tick, each human being? Or is it always applied to a species, certain species of moth, certain species of tick, the human species? Woolf's The Waves and Spinoza's Ethics suggest that at least with regard to beings of the complexity of human beings, we each have our own dispositions and capacities, our own capacities to affect and be affected, and that these capacities differ among individuals of the same species. And yet the Waves and the Ethics attempt to also think in terms of human being and other living beings in general. So too it seems to me that von Uexküll mostly tries to get outside the particularity of individuals and to think in terms of species. As such, any human Umwelt would need to be deviously complex, since it would carry within it not simple operations and perceptions, but an indefinite number of operations and perceptions. Perhaps this explains von Uexküll's leap to the spiritual dimension, a dimension that somehow involves divine understanding or intelligent design. Von Uexküll wrote a book called The Theory of Meaning. The word theory comes from the Greek to spectate. The word meaning comes from the Indo-European root for mind. That is, to develop a theory of meaning involves spectating or speculating on thought. to see it as if from outside, as if with indifference, like the observers imagined by science. In The Waves, two protagonists, Rhoda and Lewis, desire not to be in the normal way. Rhoda imagines herself as barely being at all, invisible, abstract, a pure spectator upon the world. She may well be a portrait of the anonymous writer Woolf herself desires to become. Lewis, with an extreme effort of the will, tries to become something other than himself, overriding the ostracized outsider, the colonial boy from Australia. With a businessman who coolly connects worlds, and a poet who exists across and within all civilizations. As I've said, critics have argued he's based on Woolf's friend, who was American, not Australian, T.S. Eliot. These two are able to see a kind of vision where people are or can be abstract before they resolve into particular being. It is seemingly only at this point that the meaning of being can be grasped. The fin far out in the sea might be caught. Lewis says, "But now look as we stand here. A ripple breaks on the horizon. The net is raised higher and higher. It comes to the top of the water. The water is broken by silver, by quivering little fish. Now leaping, now lashing, they are laid on shore. Life tumbles its catch upon the grass. There are figures coming towards us. Are they men or are they women? They still wear the ambiguous draperies of the flowing tide in which they have been immersed." And Rhoda answers, "Now," said Rhoda, "as they pass that tree, they regain their natural size. They are only men and women. Wonder and awe change as they put off the draperies of the flowing tide. Pity returns." If one were to imagine the Umwelt being as Jakob von Uxküll imagined, a bridge between science and humanities, it would have to have these two sides. On the one side, a human is limited by the narrow sphere of their existence. On the other side, a human's will seemingly far exceeds the limit of their own particular being, driven by longing, spurred by emulation, spreading opening to effects and percepts beyond the reach of their own sensations, and then desiring to express this excess, to make a territory others can share. This is how Neville in The Waves imagines himself to be. "I am merely Neville to you, who see the narrow limits of my life and the line it cannot pass. But to myself I am immeasurable, a net whose fibers pass imperceptibly beneath the world. My net is almost indistinguishable from that which it surrounds. It lifts whales, huge leviathans and white jellies. What is amorphous and wandering, I detect, I perceive." Is the great net of human understanding and imagination the Umwelt, or one side of it? Or is the Umwelt the self one perceives, one's own self, as it is torn by life? Neville continues, "Beneath my eyes opens a book. I see to the bottom. The heart, I see to the depths. I know what loves are trembling into fire, how jealousy shoots its green flashes hither and thither, how intricately love crosses love, love makes knots, love brutally tears them apart. I have been knotted, I have been torn apart." So in conclusion, this colloquium wishes to address the limits of ethology as a discipline that has not achieved its potential. Implied is the question as to why this might be so. What is striking as one reads into the discipline and considers the problems it sets out to confront is the imagined figure of the enemy that occurs in Lorenz, in Eibel Eibsfeld, in Bergson, in von Uxküll, in Simondon, in Spinoza, in Deleuze and Guattari, in Woolf. The enemy has misunderstood and even discounted the importance of phylogenesis for Lorenz. For von Uxküll, the enemy is like a colorblind person. They are meaning blind, and his very theory explains why. They are incapable of certain affects. For Spinoza, the enemy fails to understand so many things and perversely puts forward counter-understandings based on their narrow vested interests. Those who claim scripture and not nature is where God reveals his truth. those who claim mankind is a kingdom within a kingdom, rather than merely being another mode of being among many, which, like all others, is subject to the laws of nature. Deleuze and Guattari want to fuck philosophy up the arse, because it imposes an image of thought that narrows our potential. For Simondon, atomists and hylomorphic thinkers have long imposed a version of being that fixes it in place, rather than seeing it as being comprised of relations that are only ever metastable, becoming individuated, and then becoming something else. For Bergson, the enemy seeks to fix being by considering time to be another kind of space, rather than essentially involving movement. For Woolf, the enemy may even be within. The Virginia Woolf who doubts and calls her masterpiece ugly and a failure. The Virginia Woolf who frets that readers will simply be confused. Who wonders whether the role of art is to entertain and cover over suffering rather than focusing on it, spectating on minds and what they feel. Could global capitalism be understood as an Umwelt? Could the concept be bent that far, even in fiction or literary critical speculation? If so, does it involve specific and identifiable limitations on meaning? Do certain theoretical methods equally limit our capacity to think? Perhaps because they're focused on practical outcomes that might be justified to funding bodies within globalized systems of higher education. Perhaps that is because they are disposed in certain ways. Ethology requires an understanding that forcefully links our capacities to our environments. Our cultures, on the other hand, still see our principal capacities as human beings as mastery over the environment. The failure or limitation of ethology might merely reflect who is winning the struggle. Yet, as we're perhaps seeing, the truth expressed by nature will have the final word. There are many stories, Woolf claims in The Waves, but which story is true? This can be put another way. The story ethology tells is true to nature, but this doesn't mean it will necessarily be the story that gets to be told when its truth threatens so many enemies, with their longings, their emulations, their deeply felt desires. So that's the end of my paper. Thank you very much if you managed to listen to the end. As I say, I sincerely hope that you're all doing well where you are, and I look forward to listening to other people's papers and hopefully working through discussions on Zoom.